It seems we're in a very paradoxical time, that in some ways you can look at many different kind of indicators and say this is the best time to be alive. And yet at the same time, you and a lot of other writers that I'm following have a real kind of apocalyptic tinge to their writing. Are those two things true at the same time?
That's a very good question. Let me see if I can puzzle it out. So one of the metaphors that I've found is very helpful is the metaphor of a caterpillar voraciously devouring leaves. So from the point of view of the caterpillar, there is the experience of becoming fatter and fatter, and all things are going well. It's good to be a fat caterpillar. Now from the point of view of the leaves, things are going rather poorly. And if you zoom back out, you will look at it and say, there's a paradox that on the one hand, it's never been a better time to be a caterpillar. And on the other hand, I'm noticing that the leaves are getting ready to go away, and so things are about to get very bad very quickly. But then there's even deeper insight, which is that caterpillars devour and destroy everything around them in the process of endeavoring to become a butterfly. And so I think that's actually the deeper notion, that if you look at our civilization from the perspective of it is a caterpillar, it is becoming more of what it is, so it's flourishing on that basis. It is rapidly consuming a substantial fraction of the environment that's necessary for it to continue being what it is. And then this ends up in one of two possible states. Either it hits some kind of wall where some piece of that support structure fails, in which case it just dies, or it actually enters into this moment of metamorphosis and it transforms into another kind of being altogether. I think that's the perspective that I'm bringing. I can't speak for anyone else.
What are the indicators that make you think that things are getting much worse than maybe they appear on the surface?
Well, I guess probably the most important is the fact that I've been looking at this now for quite some time. And so the models that I've been using to try to make sense of a number of different, call it just systems for now, different pieces or characteristics of the world, have predicted a number of things that were, at the time, didn't seem to be reasonable. Let's go with like the Trump election. This is kind of a very concrete one. So the models predicted Brexit. The models predicted Trump, or something along those lines. Not exactly, but events of those characteristics.
Your specific models?
My specific models, right. And so in some sense, I'm kind of simple. If I have models, and the models are predictive, and particularly when they're predictive in a way that is contra conventional wisdom, I give those models more credence. So I run lots of models. I don't have like 2 or 3. I've got lots and lots of models, and some of them have been increasingly accurately predicting circumstances, and others have been less. And so these have begun, pay less attention to these and give more credence to these. And as I watch these are the ones that tell me that we're on a particular kind of trajectory. And that trajectory has, it has characteristics that you can use to say, okay, here's what it looks like and here's how it will play out. And more importantly, it actually has a very specific finite endpoint, so that we're on the kind of trajectory that has an ending to it. And that many of the metrics or many of the phenomenon that we're witnessing in many different ways. Right now it's showing up very viscerally in terms of the way that culture and society are feeling, particularly in the West, are indicative of the fact that we're kind of far along the curve on this particular dynamic. So that's the way that I'm going about doing it. So and there's a lot of, unfortunately, explaining that, double-clicking on that is not easy. I've actually spent some time creating some YouTube videos and some Medium posts trying to actually take a particular set of concepts and like making them small enough to convey in a bite. And I guess some of that's been successful.
But if we're talking about a curve, and you're saying that we're far along this curve and it has an endpoint, what is the curve and what is the endpoint?
Well, the reality is there's actually many, many curves, and they're not all the same, meaning that they don't have the same basis, they don't have the same causal structure behind them. So I'll give you 3. One curve is called the tainter curve. The tainter curve was used by an anthropologist to try to figure out and describe why it was that complicated civilizations collapsed. He actually called it the collapse of complex civilizations, but I have to modify that for specific reasons. And we can investigate, if you'd like, what this curve is and why it works and how it shows up, but it has to do with the way that human beings design and reinforce the kinds of institutional structures that we use to meet our needs. And there's a particular set of characteristics of how these structures become bound, meaning they become, well, let's use oil as an example. So in the beginning, we use oil, largely for kerosene, by the way, to light things up. And as a secondary distillate, we have gasoline. We don't really use much gasoline, and it's actually kind of easy to get. You're in Pennsylvania, and with a little bit of effort, you can get some oil out of the ground. So then we begin to say repurpose gasoline into being fuel for cars, and so this increases the utility and the value. So this expands the potential of our civilization. So we've kind of moved up this curve. Our energy usage, the amount of energy we have to spend to get the oil and convert it to gasoline, returns a substantial return on energy investment. And so we do, right? So what ends up happening is two distinct things simultaneously. One is we actually expand our underlying use of this energy source. We build more cars. And maybe because it makes it easier for us to grow food, we grow more food, so then we have more people. So we expand the base that uses and relies upon this capacity. But at the same time, we're also plucking the low-hanging fruit of access to the resource. So it gets harder. We have to actually drill deeper wells, or we have to frack to be able to pull out the kind of oil. Now what's interesting is, this is why I said it's complex. This is not a simple thing. It's actually the second order that matters. Because what we'll do is we'll say, okay, well, it's gotten harder, so we'll invest in R&D. So we'll get smarter. So we get certain advancements in the underlying technical basis that we use to extract the resource. So we have a curve on the technical basis. But what ends up happening is that as we're picking the lowest hanging fruit at the resource level, we're also picking the lowest hanging fruit at the R&D level. Right? So there's a certain period of time where our R&D is kicking ass. We spend $1 million on R&D, we get massive advances. But at a certain point in time, that has what's known as an S-curve, meaning that we've picked all the low-hanging fruit in innovation space. We've figured out all the easy wins, and now we're starting to have to work harder to get harder wins. We figured out how to do drilling that goes diagonal, and that was one really nice win, and we got that one. Now we have to do fracking. Now we have to do whatever's next, right? So it just gets harder and harder and harder. So at a certain point, what happens is that we may have to spend $100 million to get a 2% increase in performance, while simultaneously, we're now really picking deep fruit. So it's getting deeper and deeper and harder and more expensive to extract. And in the meantime, over on this side of the house, we've built out an entire gigantic global infrastructure that absolutely is fully fundamentally dependent on gasoline for virtually everything. Like if your car stopped tomorrow, you couldn't get groceries, right? So we become more dependent on the resource. We tap out the R&D cycle, which in the beginning looks awesome. We're getting massive gains until we've reached the end point. And we've gotten to the end of the easy pickings, as things are getting harder and harder and harder. So what happens is we generate fragility. We generate an environment where we're having to spend more and more energy, either in terms of R&D or in terms of just absolute activity, to maintain where we are, but it's actually getting harder and harder to hold. And the consequences of falling back become worse and worse. Now this curve actually has one other characteristic to it, which is we're now way over our skis. Like it may have been that, call it 1920, 1930, we could have decided to shift and go from a gasoline economy to, say, an electricity economy, and we don't get committed to cars. But we've passed that fork in the road. So all the different choices we could have made in the past have now become narrowed and narrowed and narrowed until we just have to double down more and more and more on this. So we've actually kind of like become an addict. We've become addicted to a particular approach, and just like an addict, that approach is starting to give us diminishing returns. And so that hits a wall. And so that's the tainter curve in a nutshell. And there's, this can happen across particular domains. So you might show oil, and oil might show up in just the domain that I described, which was technology, resource, and economy. But you might also see how it shows up in geopolitics. I mean, it may be that we have to actually go out and say, use our military to sustain the Saudi regime, not because we like them or think that they're philosophically aligned, but because they have oil. And if we don't have oil, our economy collapses, right? So now we're generating externalities in the environment, right? We're creating pollution, and we're generating externalities in geopolitics, which creates systemic fragility in other places. And so the point is that as you're creating something which becomes more and more and more fragile with more and more impact, you're setting yourself up for a bad situation. And you can't back out of it elegantly, right? You're very much having to go forward. And so what ends up happening is that rarely, on some very rare circumstances, there's enough consciousness and enlightened choice making to be able to recognize that things are not working out and that we need to step back and shift. And maybe that's happened 2 or 3 times in human history. It's a very rare thing. Most of the time what ends up happening is that we run smack into the wall, particularly because quite often the decision makers are in a position where they feel like they can actually insulate themselves from the negative consequences. Right? So it's okay to run the hoi polloi into the wall because we're going to be okay. What they don't realize is that they are actually sitting on top of the hoi polloi and it's all a seamless web. And so what ends up happening is the elites basically drive us right off the cliff because they don't fully feel the consequences of the choices that they're making. So that's the tainter curve. Another one, which is reinforcing it, is something I'm calling the Bryce Heidi-Smith model, the 2 individuals who explained it to me. And it works kind of like this. You have basically a series of phase transitions in game theory. So in the beginning, you have a group of individuals who are tightly coherent and are able to maintain their ability to, I don't know if you know how the prisoner's dilemma works, but their ability to resolve the prisoner's dilemma by not defecting on each other. Now this happens due to very well functioning, call it justice mechanisms, meaning people have a felt sense that if they defect, they will have negative consequences. Right? So they feel like they're playing a multiple version of the prisoner's dilemma game, so that if they act badly, the consequences will come back to them, and so they choose to act well, and that generates the global optimum, which is better, and so this group is thrives, right? So you've got a group that's working well. It can solve collective action problems effectively. And so what happens is that it grows, right? It thrives, and so it grows. It brings new people in or expands its population on its own basis, whatever it happens to be. And so you might imagine, let's just make a simple version. The first version is an actual tribe. So this is a tribe and it's relating to nature. And what happens is that as it becomes successful, the tribe expands and it expands and expands and expands until the mechanisms that it originally used to close the loop on justice, to make sure that everybody took responsibility for not defecting, become more and more attenuated until they start to open up little gaps, some possibilities where I can maybe get away with something and it won't affect, I won't have to bear the full cost, or there's some reasonable probability that I won't have to bear the full cost. So the game theory starts to shift. So now you might imagine that the tribe was relating to nature, but now the tribe has become the niche. So what will end up happening is little tiny micro tribes will begin to emerge, who are actually figuring out ways that they can develop local selective advantage themselves on the body or on the surface of the nation, of the society. And so what ends up happening is that, criminal gangs, for example, but also bureaucracies and bureaucrats. Any circumstance where I can begin to have a local selective advantage by playing a rule where, from my perspective, what I'm doing is not catastrophic, and I'm playing a small win. I'm not bringing down the whole frickin' society. All I'm doing is skimming a little bit off the top. And the society doesn't have the capacity to enforce at a high enough level of probability and magnitude, justice, the loop coming back to me, then game theory says that people will begin to play that game. So the problem is that as you begin to do that, it begins to actually create a downward spiral, meaning that, well, if you're cheating and I'm not, then I'm losing. And this is the classic, it's called the multipolar dilemma. It shows up in all kinds of different stories about collective action problems. A classic example might be if we're all fishing from a shared fishing resource, and if we all only fish 100 fish, the resource works great. If we all fish 1,000 fish, the resource completely collapses. But if you can get away with fishing 500 fish and I'm only fishing 100 fish, then the resource base survives and you win.
It's called the tragedy of the commons.
That's one example. There's many, many examples. That's one of them. The broader concept is a multipolar trap or multipolar dilemma. And it is ubiquitous. Like, it just shows up. It's what happens in a context where their gaps emerge in the ability to enforce justice, enforce closed loops in defection behaviors. And so what ends up happening is that the body of the society continues to endure for a while because there's generativity involved in just lots of people working together in a culture and a society, but the cracks begin to form. And as the cracks form, it drives choice making, meaning that the virtuous, remember the Game of Thrones? Funny, I have to invoke it. The virtuous begin to lose. Remember the Starks and the Lannisters. The Starks live at the border. They live at the border with nature. They live next to the wall where winter is. So for them, the reinforcing mechanisms to keep those justice loops closed are pretty strong. And so they obey the law intrinsically. Remember at the very beginning, was it Ned Stark, the leader, said, like, you have, as the king, you must enforce the law yourself. This is good justice. Go all the way to the center of empire, far away from the border, where the justice loops aren't as the feedback loops aren't as stark. Right? You aren't necessarily going to be killed by winter if you're living in King's Landing. So now the Lannisters down in King's Landing, they are experts at playing the defection game. They're experts at figuring out how to play the cracks so you can't quite be certain that they're the ones who fucked you over. And so they can get a little bit of an extra win. So if you're not playing the game, remember that was the phrase in the poker game? If you look around the poker table, you don't know who the sucker is, that's you. That comes from this phase. So what ends up happening is that everybody begins to either be a sucker, in which case they're the ones who get their heads cut off, or they have to start being a player. Now, of course, as everyone becomes, that's a self-reinforcing feedback loop. And at that point, if you look around the table and literally everybody is looking for taking out the sucker except for you, then you're screwed, right? Then you're dead. So now you enter into the final stage. The final stage is what they call the fractal defection stage, which is the defection starts to eat at the very fabric of what holds the society together, and eventually the entire thing is in fact actually put into jeopardy. You can't trust anyone, you can't get anything done, bureaucracy is hypertrophied. You have to assume that every interaction is an interaction of multiple layers of manipulation, coordination costs go through the roof, and again, the whole society collapses from the global optimum to the local optimum of prisoner's dilemma, and boom, you're done. So that's another curve, all right? And so we've got two distinct curves.
And that seems like a process that's being sped up by an actor like Trump, who is explicitly going from that perspective. Like one of Trump's rules is you cannot trust anyone. And so he's building that narrative into the global system.
Well, I think there's two things. First is I'm going to put an asterisk next to Trump, which is to say that quite often people try to think that they understand him, and so then they reify him into some sort of artifact that I certainly don't know him well enough to be able to say anything specifically about him. So what I can do is I can identify a particular character that has certain characteristics. And so that's not a bad story. There's certainly a Trump character who shows up with those characteristics. You might say that he's the embodiment of a particularly aggressive poker player who's happy to play chaos, right, and understands how to thrive in chaos. And fundamentally is kind of peak predator of fractal defection land. That's just where he comes from. And so for him, it's intuitive and sensible that one behaves in this fashion. And therefore, it's very effective in this stage, right? It's, the Lannisters outcompete the Starks until chaos actually happens, right? Until winter actually comes, it's actually better to be a Lannister than a Stark in King's Landing. And so, but then, yes, this is the point. That it accelerates the process. Again, it's actually, sorry, I think you may have pointed out something separate, which is equally important. If I am of that sort, if I'm playing that kind of game, it's in my interest to make sure the game is of that sort. So I actually have an interest to break the justice links, to make things more chaotic, because I thrive in that niche. I thrive in chaos. I don't thrive in order. In order, I might in fact be called out and hung from the nearest tree. So I actually need to spin more chaos because that's where I thrive. So yes, you've got both my activities make more chaos, but then even intentionally, I have an invested interest in increasing the amount of chaos just because that's what I'm good at. So that's an example of a second curve. Then we've got other curves. Let's take, for example, the exponential technology curve. One of the interesting characteristics about exponential curves is that they go to infinity. As far as we know, we don't have the ability to go to infinity in, say, processing power, which means that at some point they have to actually stop being exponential. They have to be some kind of an S-curve, or by the way, just a straight drop. So when we take a look at where we are on the exponential, on the technology curve, we're getting into pretty significant exponentials. We're doing some very powerful things. And one, it is for sure the case that at some point in the not too distant future, by that I might mean 100 years or 1,000 years, we reach the end of that exponential. All you have to do is sort of forward project Moore's law, multiply by the amount of BTUs per unit processing power, and you get to the point where the computational energy on the planet generates enough entropy to evaporate the entire atmosphere, for example. Or the atomic bound of quantum mechanics can't actually produce any more forward advancement. So that's a curve that has a certain characteristic. But let me talk about a variation of what happens in that context. So let's go back to game theory. So I'm playing a game to win, and you're playing a game to win. And the way this game works is it's a zero sum. So if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. And this shows up a lot, right? So if we're playing that kind of game, it's going to have a certain characteristic. Now, in this game, I have a strong incentive to become more effective, because otherwise I'll lose, right? And you have a strong incentive too. So one of us is going to be able to be more effective than the other, and we're going to be the winner. Now, if it's not a catastrophic win, meaning if I don't extinguish you, if I don't kill you, if you're still in the game, then you have a really strong incentive to be very exploratory and try to figure out some novel way to route around me. And we see this happening, for example, in capitalism. This is one of the virtues of capitalism. It uses this mechanism to drive innovation. So if my company outcompetes your company either is going out of business or it has to be more innovative. Well, what that does is what pushes us along the innovation curve. And so it increases the exponential, it increases the rate of that exponential. Now, all is well and good, except for a couple of things. One is, as we're engaging in conflict with each other, we're creating some set of externalities. Right? We're producing some kind of waste energy into the system. It might be that just the simple act of producing goods and services generates pollution and stuff like that. Or it may be that how I market my product into the marketplace creates jams the sense-making systems that human beings use to figure out what are good choices for themselves. It doesn't matter, like fill in the blank. There's some non-zero externality that is produced. And you kind of multiply that by the power, the magnitude of what we're doing. So if what we're doing is gathering sticks to create fire, that has one level of externality. If what we're doing is nuclear power, that has another level of externality. It's a much larger one and potentially very significant. Well, what moving along the exponential tech curve means is increasing our power. So as we move further and further up the curve, which we have to because of the competitive dynamic, one of the things that we intrinsically do is we increase the risks associated with the magnitude of power that we're playing with. So for example, very concretely right now, we're in a situation where, say, CRISPR-Cas9 has taken the nightmares of germ and genetic warfare that were just nightmares in the 1970s. Like in the 1970s, we had this concern that we might engineer superviruses, or we might engineer different kinds of super toxins. And realistically, only a handful of nation states had the technical capacity to do something like that, and they were able to contain that. Well, now with CRISPR-Cas9, in the next 2 decades or so, a reasonably well-funded multinational corporation will have that capacity. And in the decade after that, and anything vaguely like exponential, maybe a high school chemistry class will have that level of capacity. Well, just stochastic risk means that somebody somewhere is going to fuck it up. So we're talking about massive consequences just because the magnitude of power and increasing fragility. Even a small deviation. Back in 1900, the totality of all of humanity, if we all made terrible choices, really couldn't meaningfully threaten the species. The worst wars we'd ever fought had barely been a blip in population growth. Even World War II, and all of its ferocity, was not meaningfully significant in the total survivability of the species. Click past the invention of the nuclear bomb, and then the hydrogen bomb, and then multipolar hydrogen bombs, and suddenly we're in a situation where for the first time in the history of history, we did in fact have the capacity to kill everybody, or at least mostly everybody. And in that case, it only required that 2 people affirmatively choose not to push a button at the same time to avoid that problem. So we qualitatively shifted from one place where we couldn't possibly hurt ourselves to a place where we could, but still it was a relatively easy thing to do, and we barely made it. Right? We barely made it past that threshold. And now what's happening is that as we're moving up that exponential curve, the magnitude of power continues to increase. It becomes decentralized. It gets pushed further and further out to more and more empowered groups, smaller groups. And therefore, we're moving into a state where, in the not too distant future, effectively everybody is going to have to be enormously wise and skillful to avoid creating catastrophic consequences. So that's another curve. All right? So the point is that we've got a lot of curves. And we can actually take very small curves, like the Hubble curve with oil reserves. We can take bigger curves, like the Tainter curve or the Bryce-Heide-Smith model. Or we can look at a fundamental curve, like this relationship between game theoretic rivalrous dynamics and exponential technology and how that relates to fragility. But all of these are kind of pointing in the same direction, which is that there's something about the nature of how we do civilization now that is leading us to a circumstance where fragility is being built into the system at many, many different layers.
You've also talked about the way that the dialogue is going. The increased polarization of the dialogue is that we're staking out ideological positions that are very difficult for us to communicate with the other side.
Well, this is both a cause and a symptom. So let's take a look at it from the point of view of being a cause. Easy enough, right? If I am playing a political game to win, then I am incentivized to generate a set of signals, stories, that create a maximum intensity of separation between my group and other groups, so long as my group's the biggest. Right? So what ends up happening is you have a natural, in a winner-take-all democracy, where 51% wins everything, there's a maximum incentive to generate a narrative that creates a strongly bound group. And of course, what this almost always implies is to create a strongly bound group that has a natural antipathy to some other set of groups. Right? We have a natural incentive to create strongly oppositional groups. And then what happens is that it'll sort of tend to orbit around 50% on either side because that's power shifts back and forth. But then it will tend to polarize because that's just the natural dynamics. That if I'm the more polar, the guys in the middle end up getting dropped out because the binding agent of extreme threat is stronger than the binding agent of extreme reasonableness under most circumstances. And this is not a logical law. This is more of a human socio-political law. But we've noticed this. It actually happens all the time. We see it happen all over the place. And it's happening right now for sure, where in a level that I think these days, I don't even have to speak about it theoretically. Like most people, I think, are aware of the fact that there's a trend in their lived experience where the polarization of the language is increasing over time and it's self-reinforcing. I mean, honestly, like at this point in the US, you either are, what was the right way of putting it? So this is the most recent one. So if you're on the right, that means that you have blood on your hands because you support gun rights and therefore effectively have pulled the trigger on killing millions of people and simultaneously are effectively interested in fully supporting and directly engaging in genocide against immigrants. Right? This is the level of the rhetoric. Right? It's not a level of rhetoric of, I disagree with you on immigration policy. Level of rhetoric is that you are comparable to the worst things that have ever happened in human history because of your beliefs. And of course, the opinion is symmetric, meaning that if you're on the left, you are a radical, completely insane, what is it, liberalism is a mental illness, completely insane, authoritarian, hell-bent on simultaneously engendering genocide against, in this case, white people.
Or unborn children.
And for sure unborn children, of all races, by the way, so you're actually nihilistic in that sense. It has to do with essentially nihilism. Essentially, you are fundamentally desiring to hurt and kill yourself, and in the process of doing that, you're doing it at the broader social level. So it's really treason.
Why has it gotten so worse now? Is it social media?
Well, again, I think there's actually a number of different forces at play, but let's focus on the last one that you just mentioned. So one of the things that's not often enough contemplated, and therefore worth talking about, is the fact that we're in the middle of a major transition in media infrastructure. And that has a lot of impact, has a lot of consequences. So the legacy media infrastructure, and by the way, when I say media infrastructure, I literally mean the way that as a group, as a society, we are able to collectively make sense of what's going on in the world and then inform ourselves about what choices to make. So it used to be broadcast. Still is mostly, but very much used to be only. And by broadcast, I mean something like some small group of individuals, maybe even just one, have authority to speak, and everybody else has responsibility of listening. So whether that's a teacher at the head of a class or it's a newscaster broadcasting over television, there's this relationship of small number of speakers, large number of listeners, and no intercommunication, right? So even if I'm listening, I can't even ask questions. I can just listen. And as a modality of communication and of sense-making, this has certain effectiveness. If you do a very, very good job of empowering the people to speak who speak, then they're saying the right things. And so you want the most competent, most honest, most clear-headed, most thoughtful individuals to be empowered. You want them to be credentialed. You want some sort of mechanism to credential and identify them. You give them the speaker, they speak, and everybody else gets the best information. That's actually not bad. We can go into, if you'd like, into some depth on what the limitations of that approach are and how it can actually end up being disrupted and hijacked, which of course it has. But for the moment, let's just say, okay, that's what it has been for a long time. And this has implications for how individuals show up. Right? Psychologically, developmentally, as a child, we're very plastic. And so as we're emerging, we're looking around our environment, trying to figure out, well, what do we do? How are we successful? And if the way that you're successful is either you get really good at listening, understanding what the right beliefs are, and then executing on them effectively, that's how you get rewarded. You get the A+ on the test by doing it that way. Or you figure out how to climb the ladder on being credentialed so you get to be the one to speak. Right? That if that's what success looks like, then that's the kind of psychological model that you'll develop as a human most of the time, unless something's wrong with you and you can't ride that elevator. And so you end up with a self-reinforcing system where the topology of the overall media constructs this dynamic, and then the developmental psychology constructs people who are adapted to that environment, so they reinforce it on themselves. Now you shift. Obviously, for the past 20 years on an accelerating curve, we've been moving into a completely different kind of media topology. That a peer-to-peer network, right, the internet, behaves completely differently. Right? It no longer has this model where, by physical nature, a small number are the only ones who can speak, and everyone else must listen and cannot communicate back. It has a completely different nature. It's more like our conversation. Right? I speak, in this case, more. You speak too, though, right? And you have the ability to ask questions. You can direct the conversation. We're actually in a conversation. And so this is a different topology. It's a different relationship of power. And it also requires a different adaptive behavior, right? So we can maybe get into that in a bit on what that looks like. But the thing that you're calling out is the fact that we're in the middle. We're in a spot where the old structure still largely controls most psychologies and most of the primary institutions of power.
What you've called the blue church.
What I've called the blue church, exactly. The new structure is emergent, right? It's coming up from the bottom. It's happening all over the place. And they're struggling. It's just a conflict. It's a conflict at the level of sense-making. It's a conflict at the level of what kind of psychologies are adaptive. And it's the conflict at the level of who gets to speak. And therefore, the messages are fractured and broken up all over the place. And of course, this is chaos. And then we get kind of cycle back to maybe the Trump phenomenon. That when chaos emerges, the particular approaches that are very good at playing in chaos will tend to be more successful than approaches that are better at playing in order, for example.
In a celebrated essay for Medium after the Trump election of 2016, Greenhall described how a new online red religion was attacking the consensus liberal reality, the blue church.
You talked about the blue church and the red religion as an insurgency against the blue church. Where do you think we're at?
Well, so since we have a little bit of opportunity to be more explicit, I want to make sure to break a few things out. So I identified a couple of distinct, let's call them entities. They may not necessarily be self-consciously identifying as entities, but they're collaborative. They work together for some set of reasons. So whether they're happening to be working together de facto or intentionally is irrelevant. So there's at least three. One I'm going to call the establishment. And the establishment you might think of as just the inertial consequences of like builds more like. Right? So if I go to school at Harvard, then I meet other people who are at school at Harvard. And the people who graduated before me also went to Harvard. Maybe I met them too because of the way the school sets up relationships. When I come out of school, I'm in a situation where I have social bonds, pretty strong social bonds, some of the strongest that we form in our current society with the people I went to school with. And they're going to various locations where they have vertical relationships with former classmates that give them some advantage. So what's happening is I basically have a very simple vector. I'm more likely to achieve authority and power because of this particular moment, this particular social environment. Run that over 100 years, which is more or less the time frame that we're talking about here, 150 years or so. And you have an establishment. You have a group of individuals who have been in relationship with each other that are relatively tightly connected, and as human beings are wont to do, tend to relate in a fashion which is coordinated with each other. They have similar sensibilities, they have similar values, they kind of like each other because they're friends, they hang out in the same places, and so they kind of coordinate and work together. They certainly influence each other enormously because you can only listen to so many people. And you really care about people who are socially connected, right? So if your sister's husband is the current head of NBC, and you're the current head of Harvard, then he's going to care what you think and you're going to care what he thinks because you're in-laws. And by the way, you're both in established positions of authority, which means that you have high credentials to be important, right? So that's just the establishment. The second one is the deep state, right? The deep state, which is astounding to me, which is, I think, 5-7 years ago, that would have been almost nobody would have had that language and that concept, and now almost everybody does, which is a good indication that something's happening, right? The deep state is kind of playing out the establishment narrative, but now talking about it in the terms of institutional structures. So if I'm a lifer at the CIA and you're a lifer at the FBI, there's some likelihood that we have interacted with each other more than 1 or 2 times during our time frame. And if she's a lifer at the IRS, then that happens too, right? So same basic idea. There's a continuity of relationship where I have beginning to build sort of an institutional loyalty to a set of what is this local culture. The CIA has a culture, the FBI has a culture, the US military has a culture, has many different cultures. And by the way, all the corporations that have military, industrial, or government relationships do too, right? So if I'm a 30-year executive at Exxon, but I've also done 5 stints at the Department of Energy because that's how it works, these things begin to bind, right? So that forms its own relationship. You've got the establishment, you've got the deep state. They're very connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. And by the way, there are many other structures that are in the environment as well. Those aren't the only 2. Then you've got the deep church. Right? The deep church, to conceptualize that, you have to think about it at a higher level of abstraction. It's more of a psychological type and a way of being and doing, which I described earlier. But to recapitulate, there's a notion of there being some very small number of people who are authorized speakers. The nature of speech goes from small number to almost everybody, large, broadcast, and it's one way. There's no interactivity. And to become credentialized as an authorized speaker is a very powerful place to be. By the way, you can either get that by being a member of the establishment of the deep state or by being a celebrity, which is an odd artifact of broadcast media. So that complex, those 3 together, hang together more or less loosely as this phenomenon, right? So it's not just the blue church, but now if we want to refer to all of that as the blue church, we can, but just be mindful when I say the blue church, what I mean is more of the process that gives rise to a particular way of making sense and making choices and reinforcing that as a social field. So then in contrast to that, this emergent dynamic, this new phenomenon, so I characterize that as differentially as the insurgency, and also as the red religion, and then also as the decentralized medium. Right? So let's take it as 2 peers. Think about the blue church, that maps to the decentralized medium. So now I have a different media topology and different psychological typology that gives rise to different abilities to send and tell stories and different kinds of stories that are going to be upregulated. Meme magic, right? Meme magic is over here. Talking heads and classic propaganda is over here. Meme magic is over here. And they're very different in how they're shaped and who shapes them and how they show up. Now, under here, the deep state and the establishment have optimized for the blue church. Right? That's how you're successful, is to become the ones who have the ability to speak, to become the ones who have credentials, and become the ones who have control over other kinds of broadcast-style bureaucratic institutions, like pass the EPA. Small group of people get to pass the law, everybody has to follow the law. Over here, we have chaos. We have a new niche that has opened up. And nobody has figured out how to master it perfectly, so now it's wide open. Now, it turns out that if you're doing this well, you're not going to play that game. Why would you play a new game if the old game works really well and you're the expert at it, you're control of this game? So the people over here are kind of the heterogeneous or the marginal. And in this case, the losers of the last culture war, which is broadly the right, conservatives. And so one way of naming the alt-right, which is semantically confusing, which is to say the people who originally coined the term the alt-right are one group. The way the alt-right is presented in this Blue Church narrative is another one. I'm about to present a third, and maybe problematic because it's going to be confusing, but the idea is it's the way that these particular characteristics of conservatism at a level of personality type and a level of core values have begun to discover and recohere on this new framework. Or we could just call it the insurgency. Right? This is the new right, the new group of individuals and institutions that are forming over here that are very different. And they're just a different set of sensibilities. So now, where are we on that process? I articulated this narrative, I guess, right after the 2016 election. In point of fact, I actually articulated it several years before, but most notably right after the election, and described it in terms of here's a bunch of fronts of what we might think of as a war that are going to be playing out. There's the front at the level of the mass media. There's the front at the level of the deep state. There's the front at the level of globalism, and there's the front at the most fundamental level, which is a conflict between how we do collective intelligence, broadcast style versus decentralized style. And honestly, I feel like the things have played out pretty much as described. First, the insurgency, both formally through the Trump administration and informally through the kind of cluster of human beings who are gathering under this new medium, have overtly identified the mass media as fake news, right? Literally to the point where Jim Acosta, I think, recently yelled, when will you stop asking the American people to call us the enemy of the people, or whatever it happens to be, right? So we're now at the point where it is part of the consciousness that the mass media is an enemy. Now, you may agree with it or not agree with it, but it's in the consciousness, right? In a way that it wasn't 5, 10, 15 years ago. I mean, it was in some level. Rush Limbaugh has been saying this for a while, but now it is the narrative. And I think the most recent polls showed that something like 75% of Americans believe that the media is engaged in either overt manipulation or reckless propaganda. So it's sunk in. And we should just say that the structures are decreasingly credible. And their effectiveness is, I think, rather obviously becoming less and less, has less and less traction. So that's one front. And I expect that to continue to accelerate because I've noticed that they have a really abysmal strategic sense. So they seem to keep punching themselves in the face. And I expect them to keep doing so. So let's kind of check. The natural drift is away from mass media to decentralized media anyway, because the technological shift is going there. And we're also seeing it happen at the level of kind of psychological attention and credibility. So then the second layer is the layer between the deep state and the insurgency. And of course, this is also playing out. Right? We've seen the conflict happening at the top of the FBI. We've also seen it playing out in the DOJ and the State Department, all those sort of usual suspects. I don't think we have much visibility of what's going on in, say, the CIA or the NSA, but that's because they're secret. But it seems pretty evident that a conflict is occurring that is between what we would very clearly identify as the deep state, the people who are in the highest levels of some of the primary institutions, particularly at the level of law enforcement and investigation, which if I was going to try to decapitate the deep state, that's where I'd start. And it's more or less being successful, right? They're beginning to be moved out. Now, of course, the deep state is deep and is large and is powerful. So I don't think that we can call that one just yet. But I would say right now that if I had to estimate, it is substantially further along in the soccer game, World Cup. So the insurgency is ahead 2-0, and we're probably at the 75-minute mark. So the deep state's going to have to start innovating quite significantly if they want to figure out how to make up that lost ground and reestablish themselves. And part of the problem, of course, is that the deep state seems to have been unwisely continuing to believe that its ability to control the mass media is a powerful lever. It's not recognizing that it's in fact punching itself in the face by doing that. And it doesn't realize that it hasn't got the right OODA loop, the ability to respond quickly to changes in the game, and so it just keeps executing on old strategies. It's like the apocryphal Polish cavalry charging the German tanks. You know, cavalry used to kick ass, we get it, it's not going to work in this war. The war has changed. So I continue to expect that the insurgency will win this conflict now, but not massive, maybe 60% probability. Then the third front, which is the front that shows up as the new nationalism versus globalism. Again, same basic idea. It's clearly a front, and I think that's pretty straightforward, and it's clearly progressing in that direction. Right? Italy. And the EU continues to have chunks of the EU shift from at least EU, European, which in fact is actually also globalist, to nationalist. And that seems to be accelerating, not decelerating. I mean, Le Pen didn't win in France, but she did almost, right? She got in the zone. I think Merkel is right now, challenged. So the energy seems to continue to be moving in the direction of some new form of nationalism, which is contra-globalism. And of course, since the United States has been the primary agent of globalism, to the degree to which the United States is now moving in the exact opposite direction, that's really tough. Like the globalist institutions don't have a lot of ability to enforce themselves on national institutions absent the ability to actually control the national institutions directly. So, barring some scenario where things are more odd than they seem, which is plausible. I mean, certainly there's many, many possible scenarios. I'm describing one. That one is going to continue to basically be derivative of the first two with a vector in the direction away from globalism and towards increasing multipolar nationalism. And then the last, which is the most important and the most fundamental by far, which is the shift of the balance of power from the media structures of broadcast and the blue church to this new set of media structures that are decentralized. And again, that continues to move. We talked about the idea, or I mentioned the notion of meme magic. That has moved from being a thing that a very small group of individuals used almost tongue-in-cheek to a thing that is, I think, almost becoming a discipline. Like, I would not be surprised to see like a university course on meme magic anytime soon, or at least an online course. And that makes sense because just every day, more and more attention, just straight up attention, is moved to this new framework, and more people are aware at a deep visceral level that the styles and approaches and people that are most fundamentally associated with the blue church don't work. For lots of reasons. Like, they don't feel like they work. They feel incompetent or inauthentic. And these new voices, I think you've talked a lot about the intellectual dark web, are showing up almost surprisingly. But they're showing up surprisingly for this reason, which is that there's a new possibility.
Because effectively what we're seeing is the breakdown, the breakdown of this ideological structure.
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah. This is actually a really hard question. So let me see if I can...
Has Vanessa gone out? Or will we...
Yeah, I think she's gone out.
Okay.
So let me see if I can try to articulate it well. Mm-hmm. We'll see. So we talked about the way that the broadcast works, the way that it feels. And let's just use actually school. School's a nice example because most people have been in school. So the way that the broadcast works is there's a person, an authority, and that authority has two primary characteristics. One is they're the one who gets to speak, and they're the one who knows what the right answers are. Right? So they hold good opinion, and they convey it. And their job is to convey good opinions, to share with you what is in fact the right thing to think. And your job, the audience, the student, is to learn and be able to deploy good opinion, whatever it may be. Right? Now, in a very well-functioning version of this, good opinion includes critical thinking. But it's kind of a weird dynamic where the psychological, the part of the brain, the way that you're actually interacting with the brain that is associated with this style of information transfer is dissonant with critical thinking. So it's like, do as I say, not as I do. Think critically. Think critically. What did I just tell you to do? Think critically, right? I'm actually training you. What I'm actually training you to do is not to think critically, regardless of how much I say that I am. In fact, regardless of how much information I convey to you about how to think critically, right? The way you learn how to think critically is not by being taught. You learn how to think critically by thinking critically, in reality, in practice, and learning how to really feel in yourself, when does something feel off, and okay, what's uncertainty, and feel okay with uncertainty. But our actual academic environment, and say under the regime of standardized tests, as an example, under the regime of it's a competitive landscape to be the one or two people who get to go to the good college so they can get the good job like this. So under the like the evolution of the way the education is operated in the States, the regime of standardized tests. So we want to be able to be sure that the school is doing a good job, so we create a test. And what that does, of course, is it begins to make it so that students want to optimize against that test, particularly if the test has color, like the SAT, where you have to get a good score on the SAT if you want to get into a good college, and you have to get a good college to be able to get a good job. And by the way, you have to get a good job to be able to simultaneously live a good life and to be a good person, kind of. So that's the story. So this creates a gradient, right? It creates a competitive landscape where you have to optimize against what are the characteristics necessary to do well in these very, in some sense, simple tests. Whether it's a particular style of brain, style of mind, right? You have to be able to very quickly and with high fidelity be able to access information and respond with the right information effectively. Right? It's computational mind, it's information processing mind. And information processing mind isn't the same kind of mind that's able to do, say, creative thought or critical thinking. It's a different style of brain. Many people who have criticized education have been pointing this out. This is not me in any way. So when we use the concept, when we use the term ideology, what I'd like to propose is that ideology is nothing but a pre-existing manifold of information that somebody somewhere, not you, has largely constructed and has presented to you as a preformed menu. And it's some list of stuff that orients what is right and true, and your job is to receive it, figure out where you are on that list, and then choose whatever the choice is that's associated with it.
Like a computer program.
Exactly like a computer program. And so an ideology is how to run like a computer program. And it may be a very sophisticated ideology that has all kinds of if-then statements and branches, so it has a lot of ability to process complex environments to some level of effectiveness. But nonetheless, you're thinking like a computer, which is quite distinct from thinking like a human, for example, creatively, intuitively. And so the Blue Church construct, as a construct, tends to prefer and generate this style of thinking. And you just think again about how it shows up in school. Who raises their hand first? Who has the right answer quickly? Who's able to respond very perfectly exactly what the teacher said? If you're the student who maybe has a different idea about how this should be done, and you're maybe asking a lot of questions, you're probably not familiar with having a lot of success in school. It's quite likely that you experienced yourself as somehow losing in some way that was mysterious. And that's the point, right? It's not necessarily the intent, it's the nature of how this thing reinforces. It's just like an evolutionary niche. It just reinforces a certain set of behaviors and strategies. And this shows up all over the place. So think about the glibness of how things show up in news or in politics, right? If in news and politics, it's all about being able to, it's almost like stand-up comedy, right? The job is to be able to say the thing that is the barb or the gotcha or the framework that delivers the emotional payload that's already sort of been pre-arranged in the computer program. You're playing a game. You're playing a computer game. That's all you're doing. And that computer game, just like any other computer game, has a series of states and it has a series of moves. And remember that old game, I think it was called King's Quest or Dragon Quest, where it was as stupid as like it was a cinematic would play, and you just had 4 moves, up, down, left, right. And your only job was to watch the cinematic and go the right direction. It's like that level of stupidity. So then what happens is that you run into 2 distinct dynamics simultaneously. One is when you move into this new framework, in this new decentralized medium, it requires a completely different kind of mind. That kind of mind doesn't work particularly well. And the kind of mind that it requires is very different. It requires a mind that can actually think. It requires a mind that isn't only able to be a receiver, but is able to actually be able to be both a receiver and a sender. Everyone is roughly empowered to be able to express as well as to receive. And so you have to have a completely different set of capacities. Instead of being able to listen, record with extremely high fidelity precisely the semantic structure that was presented to you, identify what context to indicate that's the semantic structure to respond with, and then when confronted with those environments to respond with that, like a computer program, your job is to be able to actually discern what is actually a thoughtful response to what's happening here. In an arbitrary environment, it could be completely novel. How to learn, how to think, and then how to convey with as much clarity and fidelity as you can. Now that's the optimal functioning. I should mention, by the way, that in just the same way that there are ways to hack the blue church structure, there are ways to hack this decentralized structure. And we've seen them, right? Various kinds of trolls and memes are the ways to disrupt this, precisely to the degree to which, this is actually very important, precisely to the degree that the decentralized collective intelligence hasn't yet reached a level of self-capability to be able to make sense on its own basis. It is catastrophically vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. Right? The blue church model can't do anything about meme magic. It's completely vulnerable to that approach. And the emergent collective intelligence is basically a child. It's an infant. And so it can be attacked by this approach. However, to the degree to which a critical mass of individuals reach a capacity to have the right kind of characteristics to actually be able to participate in a peer-to-peer fashion on this front, they then generate a collective intelligence which is completely invulnerable to those sorts of attacks. So you've kind of gone through Adaptive Valley, you've escaped the blue church, you've gone through the desert of meme warfare, you've come out the other end with something which is categorically more capable of sense-making and categorically anti-fragile to this entire set of attacks. In fact, almost all forms of fake news are fully parsed by this new kind of collective intelligence.
Does that exist yet, that collective intelligence?
No, this is what I'm saying. It doesn't yet exist. And so what ends up happening is that we've got a dysfunctional because it's breaking down and has blind spots, old form of collective intelligence, and dysfunctional because it has not yet been constructed, new form of collective intelligence, and we're witnessing the middle. So this new form is just strong enough to wreak havoc on the old structure, and yet so weak that it can't stand on its own 2 feet. And so that's sort of exactly where we are. I should mention, by the way, that we should also be...
It's mature enough to destroy but not to create.
Yeah, and of course destruction is a lot easier than creation. That's a very good way of putting it. In fact, in some sense, it can't help but destroy, because the structures of sense-making of the old structure don't make sense. They aren't really good sense-making. It's, I think Brett has this idea of metaphorical truth. Let's call it something like useful lies. Here's a reality, complex, rich, nuanced, multivariant, etc. Let me sort of construct a relatively simplistic narrative that kind of describes it enough to be okay. And as long as we all sort of accept this, we can coordinate. That's the way the Blue Church operates. It's kind of like the way that GE fabricates an organizational structure. Right? I don't want you as a whole person. I want the vice president of marketing aspects of you, which are kind of fungible. Like the vice president of marketing aspects of you aren't that different from the vice president of marketing aspects of the 50 people next to you, right? You have a certain set of raw capacities that I've designed an organization to be able to interact with regardless of the human involved. It's sort of an industrial model or a mass production model. And the Blue Church has to do that with everything. It has to reduce all concepts into relatively simple ideological frameworks, not sensitive to nuance. And so they're not real. They're not actually complex. And so what ends up happening is that as a new kind of intelligence emerges that has the ability to see that this isn't actually rich, it cannot help but be corrosive to it. Now, in the beginning, it shows up as insane. And it's going to show up as not having any ability to discern what's going on. And so it's going to be upregulating all kinds of craziness, which is why conspiracy theories are going through the roof. Because it's like if you imagine somebody who just got their spinal cord severed, and they're trying to figure out how to retrain their spinal cord, the signals that are coming down are all crazy. It hasn't figured out how to actually turn that back into signals. So it can very effectively critique the structures that the Blue Church sends out, but it can't yet actually create really high quality sense. And we should be clear. I mentioned earlier, this is a psychological thing as well. I'm not talking about we're going to be the same kinds of psychologists on either side of the board. It's not like people who are blue church psychologists are suddenly going to jump over here and things will just look kind of the same but better. No. It's going to be very different. The way that ideas form and the nature of how concepts show up. Like the idea of transparadigmatic mind. Are you familiar with that idea?
Not sure.
So we have the story of a guy named Thomas Kuhn, who coined the term paradigm, structure of scientific revolutions. Yeah. So the way he talked about it was there's sort of a linearity of paradigms. We have the Newtonian paradigm, and it works until it gets to the point where there's a bunch of edge cases that it can't figure out. People are like, what's going on here? And some people want to be conservative and defend the paradigm and kind of ignore the anomalies, and other people grasp the anomalies and invent a whole bunch of crazy ideas until a couple of those crazy ideas turn out to be not so crazy. And then you get a collapse of the old paradigm and the transformation to a new paradigm. And that's a cool story. We may be on that process. It may be the blue church is a paradigm, and this new thing, this decentralized medium, is a new paradigm. My proposition is that it's actually a meta phenomenon, which is to say that it's meta to paradigms in general, that the entire concept of a paradigm is a thing that emerges inside a structure like the blue church. That's a model of how you make sense, where you have a schema, right? A paradigm is nothing but a schema of what are good epistemological rules. What does truth look like? And what are good ethical rules? What does good look like? What are the good and what are the true? How do we know what we see them, and then we can sort of bind them very cleanly. In this new environment, we're going to be, I propose, now I'm sort of in hypothetical land, I'm making predictions, running a different kind of mind, a transparadigmatic mind, one that's able to instantiate a micro paradigm under particular local conditions that is adaptive to the local environment, but isn't identified with that paradigm. And so that it can jump out of that paradigm, allow this to dissolve and instantiate a new one, or possibly even run 2 or 3 differentially. Just like modern portfolio theory in finance, where I no longer have to have sort of a particular investment strategy. I can abstract that to a portfolio of strategies, and I can keep abstracting up to a portfolio of portfolios of portfolios of portfolios. At a certain point, I get to a trans-portfolio concept, which operates at a completely different information dynamic.
So the phenomenon of the intellectual dark web, for example, seems to have arisen in opposition to this idea of the blue church, this idea of what we have is an ideology, and an ideology in the media and an ideology in culture that maybe wasn't truly visible, but the eruption of sort of the intellectual dark web has shown that, oh, there is an ideology, and this is sort of a movement that is showing up the flaws in that ideology. And that in some sense, there's a religion, and you described it in our interview really well. It's like what the blue church has done has taken the idea, the values of openness, and replace them with an ideology around openness. So you have a certain set of things related to openness that you have to believe to actually be within the confines of the blue church.
Right.
So it's kind of a religious mindset in some ways.
Well, I mean, now we're going to have to be very careful because the term religion is not clear. What I've noticed, I actually wrote about this recently, and so I've noticed in that dialogue and discovering what's going on I wrote it for the purposes of finding out, okay, how people respond to this, is that the term religion seems to have actually been complexified, for good reasons actually, by the way, to include a number of other kinds of things that it is not. At least 3. One is mysticism. Mysticism and religion are not the same. If your religion is mystical, then it's doing the wrong thing. By the way, if your mysticism is religious, it's doing the wrong thing. Another is spirituality. Religion and spirituality are also not the same. And then there's science. And we might say, quite obviously, religion is not science, but the point is that sometimes these 2 lines have crossed, and vice versa. So my propositions, let me just sort of define these domains, and my proposition is, one is that these domains are all real. They're all, by the way, necessary to any well-functioning human civilization, and that problematics arise when we cross domains, when we have one of them trying to do the other one's job, or we have institutional structures that cross domains and end up mixing them. So, for example, a lot of the problem that arose in the West was that the church, the Catholic Church broadly, was doing religion, spirituality, mysticism, and science all in a single institutional container, and ended up crossing a lot of those domains. Shall I define them? If this is worthwhile. So in the context of science, what we mean is the loop process where we have a model of reality. We then compare that to experiments of reality. for the purposes of updating that model. Done. That's it. That's science. Science is the process of having a model and using experiments to verify that model is a good fit to reality. It exists for the purpose of having good models with which to operate in reality. By the way, technology is the inverse of that. Technology is the use of good models of reality to generate actions that are effective in reality. Right? So if I have a model of, if science gives me a model of ballistics, I can then apply that model of ballistics to build ballistic missiles. So those two things fit together quite nicely. Spirituality is very different, and it has nothing to do with models at all. It has to do with embodiment, with living. And we might say that spirituality is the way that an individual is able to achieve integration, congruence with self, and then to be able to enter into relationships with world that are able to be integrated into self. Right? So how do I come into be able to be in relationship with myself where I am fully integrated and congruent? And then as I go through life and have experiences, how am I able to ingest those experiences to make those experiences still part of a fully integrated self? Right? How do I avoid being traumatized by my experiences? How do I avoid becoming disassociated as a consequence of my relationship with my experiences, or being in conflict with myself? That is spirituality. And that's the essence of what that practice is. Religion then is kind of the community correlate. It's how does self enter into relationship with other selves to form communities, and then how do communities enter into relationship with world so as to be able to be adaptive to and thrive in world. Right? So it's the embodied practices that give rise to enduring communities. Right? That is religion as a function. Now notice what happens that when we run into problems. So let's imagine that we have these embodied practices, which are embodied practices. They're not stories. We tell the stories to be able to help us understand and to convey and to reinforce the embodied practices. But if we think the stories are where the truth lives and not the practices, we've now crossed the domains. We're now beginning to treat religion like science because the stories are a model. If you're not living your religion, if it's not actually embodied in your life, you're doing it a great disservice, and yourself a great disservice, and your community a great disservice. And then, of course, you can even worse, because then what can happen is you can then try to actually do science from religion. You can try to actually tell stories about reality, about the world, and then, of course, what do you do? Because if your experiments with the world don't inform those stories, do you then use that to change your embodied practices? That seems like it's not going to be very effective, because your embodied practices have nothing to do with that. You're crossing the line in the wrong direction. So what I'd like to do is demystify this damn thing. That there's a thing, religion, that has an incredibly important purpose that sometimes we might, oddly enough, some people have thought, well, why don't you call it ideology? At which point I refer back to the definition of ideology. Ideology is what happens when science tries to do religion. It creates a model of how people ought to live in community, then tries to impose that model on how people operate. That ain't the way to do things. There's very good reasons why that can never work. It has to do with the relationship between the complex and the complicated. Or why don't you just call it culture? Aren't you just describing culture? Isn't that culture? And of course the difference is that culture is what you are doing. Religion is the doingness in a way so as to achieve a particular consequence. So religion is the process by which we develop a thriving and enduring culture. Well, that's not just the same thing as culture. You might have a shitty culture, and that's not the same thing. And religion is a vector. It's an orientation, a movement. Just like spirituality is not the same thing as just being a person. Spirituality is a process whereby we try to achieve an integration of self with self and the relationship of self with world. Okay? Then you have mysticism. Right? Now, religion quite often crosses the streams with mysticism, which is very problematic because obviously what's happening now is they're trying to create either that becomes a variation of mystifying science or it becomes a notion, well, let me just talk about what mysticism is. It becomes religion overcoding mysticism. And mysticism is the hardest. I haven't got a lot of clarity on this yet, but let me try it. It has to do with the pure relation of self with self. How do we actually become clear in self? So as opposed to how do we become integrated self in relationship with world, which is spirituality, mysticism is like, I think shows up mostly in practices like meditation, where you're not trying to relate self to world at all. You're just trying to get complete clarity on the nature of self. For example, here's a concrete version of mysticism, oddly enough. What are your values? What are your values? What are the actual basis of your values? Like kind of going deep into you. Not necessarily, no, not at all. What are your values in the context of living? But what are the values that are actually at the depth of you? that give rise to you and are their orientation and relationship. That would be like a properly mystical relationship. And it's mysterious because it is deep. The only way you can get access to it is to actually get really good at listening to things that don't have structure, because they're not coming from the outside world at all. They're entirely internal. And now, of course, what happens is these things relate to each other. To the degree to which I'm able to achieve clarity of relationship to self, I'm able to achieve clarity to the nature of how that self works, well, then I can use that in my spirituality. And so mysticism, meditation is a good practice to have as a basis of a spiritual practice, but they're distinct. Right? They're not the same thing. A spiritual practice may rely on clarity of self to achieve integration of self in relationship with the world. And similarly, religion is a good basis to do science. Right? You can't do science very well, let's say, if you're in a culture that doesn't tell the truth. If everybody's a liar, science is very, very dysfunctional. Well, religion is about how do you actually build people who tell the truth? How do you actually create the embodied practices, like child rearing is a religious function. How do you actually raise good people? What are the practices and traditions and rituals that give rise to that can only really, well, so far at least, be developed in evolution time, meaning in relationship with lineage that goes over a long period of time. This is the thing that Jordan Peterson is, I think, most clearly trying to articulate in that space. Our archetypes, our mythologies, the ones that cover a lot of cultures and last a long time, do so because they are the things that have been most deeply associated with what has fucking worked. Those cultures that do certain things in certain ways endure, and we perceive them as stories, so we can listen to them, but it's not the stories that matter, it's the embodied practices. If you're not living it, you're not doing the religious aspect. And then we can invert it, right? Science, if it's done well, can tell us a whole lot about the nature of the world. So science can tell us, like, okay, well, what are characteristics that give rise to a self that can integrate well with the world? What are the characteristics of different ways that we can make sense and make choice as a community to more effectively thrive in the world? It's information, it's ideas, it's knowledge, it's insight, but it's not living it, right? You can tell us what are good choices, you cannot make the choices. Right? So that's the distinction between these things. And with that kind of a distinction, now your question becomes much more complicated. So what I would say is that the Blue Church was an ideology, and it used ideology to play and simulate largely a religious function. That in fact, the thing that it largely replaced right about the turn of the 20th century was more of a religion, a autochthonous set of cultural practices that were largely lived and received and taught by living, that were not really the subject of information, right? They could be conveyed. I mean, you might go to church and somebody might tell you what to do, but what really matters is that every Sunday you do something, and by the way, there's something may not be go to church. Like it may be that every Sunday your family gathers together for brunch and they get together and socialize. And there's not necessarily a huge amount of consciousness. There's not like a diktat that tells you this is what you ought to do. It's rather simply what you do, and because it has worked for a long period of time. What the Blue Church has done is it overcoded that. It actually had the very bad characteristic. This is kind of that 50s scientism, that we can replace food with food in pill form, that we can replace all things that came from nature with things invented and engineered by humans. That's one of the worst vices of the Blue Church. It did lots of good stuff. I mean, it brought us to the moon, but it also had lots of vices, and this is one of them, is to try to go back in. Let's go with childbirth. I think we're all, well, maybe not we're all, but I will make this as a strong assertion. I will own this. The medicalization of childbirth that happened during the 20th century, which was largely a consequence of this mindset and distinctly reinforced by the structures of the Blue Church, was a travesty and is a fundamentally anti-religious function. That the traditions of how you go about actually doing a good job of giving birth to a child that is conducive to the holistic characteristics of what it means to be a well-born child were completely overcoded by that structure. A top-down imposed ideology, and entirely ideological and enforced by shame. Right? How many mothers right now still do not feel empowered to make their own choices on how they want to give birth to their child, but feel shame at not falling in line with what the ideological structures tell them to do? Right? That's a good example of how that shows up. So now we're actually a very interesting spot. A sizable fraction of the population is still ideologically possessed. Right? It's still running old code. It's running code that was derivative of an old machine, some of which was adaptive when it was created, some of which was malevolent when it was created, much of which is no longer adaptive, and the psychology that runs that code is not a particularly effective, it's in fact not the psychology for this new environment. So if you're running a Blue Church receiver, like your Blue Church radio, nobody's broadcasting on that signal anymore, and if they are, it's noise.
Well, the media is keeping this in place.
It's noise.
Right.
Yeah. So no truth is broadcast on that signal, or very tiny amounts of truth is broadcast on that signal. It's no longer an adaptive strategy to tune in to be a Blue Church radio. What you need to do is find a way to churn into this new meshwork to become a router, I suppose, a network-aware component that has the ability to do things like discern good signal from bad signal, powerful insight from just repetitive information, tune into that which is most insightful as opposed to merely that which is repetitive or that which is destructive, and then upregulate that with high fidelity. Take the part of the signal that is the good part, upregulate that, take the part of the signal that isn't, and downregulate that. And so by virtue of playing that role, ultimately end up being part of what generates really clean and insightful signal.
You've talked about game B in the past.
Yeah.
What is game A, what is game B, and why do we need to shift between one to the other?
So I guess what I'd like to try to do is present a frame, a way of thinking about it, where we're able to recognize that in spite of the significant diversity of approaches that have shown up in the various civilizations that have emerged since the dawn of agriculture, they are all, in a deep sense, the same kind of game. And I mean that in the sense of a game, meaning that the kind of thing that is played by people according to rules made up by people and enforced by people, not by the laws of nature, although in the context of the laws of nature for sure. And this seems to be mostly about a couple of basic characteristics. It's an effort on the part of people to be able to find a way to work together so as to address and deal with the problems of scarcity at the level of nature. Not enough food, not enough water. And with the problem of rivalry in the context of other people, both in the tribe and, of course, hostile external. Now, I would say that that's a pretty compact description of the problem that civilization exists to solve. So if your civilization can't feed you, then it's not viable. If your civilization can't find a way to prevent itself from being torn apart from the inside by people struggling against themselves, or if it can't protect itself from the outside, it can't survive. Right? So effectively, every single civilization since the dawn of civilization has been some effort to solve those three problems in the context of every other civilization. And hence history. That's game A. That entire block, every single variation on that theme is game A. And the civilization that we just currently live in is the winner of that game. And by the way, this contains both the critiques and the virtues of our current political debate. Yes, this civilization can be characterized as the center of all forms of tyranny and oppression. Yes, this civilization can be characterized as that which has innovated all virtue and all advance. These are all true. They're not paradoxical. It's just the nature of the way that game is played. So then the proposition is, for reasons we've talked about maybe ad nauseum so far today, that game is coming to an end. We cannot continue to play that style of game. That we cannot continue to operate in a rivalrous way. We cannot continue to operate in a fashion that is dominated by the logic of scarcity. And by the way, we need not, we cannot, and we need not, that we are now near a point of potential transition, and we're near a point of necessary transition. We have within us the capacity to transition into actual abundance. We have within us the capacity to transition into a way of being with each other that is premised on anti-rivalry, not rivalry, but anti-rivalry. And that this transition is a very different kind of game, game B. And it's not the kind of game that is mysterious, meaning that we've actually always been playing it a little bit. We can find locations at any point in time, and in any culture, in any environment, in any person's life, where the aspects of this have shown up. The transition is about being able to reorient the basis of civilization and put it in the right order. To put civilization on a footing of abundance and on a footing of the anti-rivals. And on that basis, then to be able to categorically resolve all questions associated with scarcity elegantly, without any real conflict. And so now on this side, I am also receiving both the optimistic and the pessimistic futurist narratives. Right? The optimistic, teleological futurist narrative is that we're on a one-way ticket to utopia. No, that's not true, but we have the possibility of getting to something that is going to feel a lot like utopia to us now. Like if we were to look at it and project forward 100 years, we'd be astounded by what can happen. Just like the courtiers in Louis XIV's court would look at our modern environment and just be astounded by the abundance of what we've been able to achieve. And then you also have the more apocalyptic narrative that if we choose the wrong set of paths and we refuse to figure out how to give up that which is not supposed to be part of this new world, and do not decide to actually build these things that are necessary and innovative, to invent new things that do not yet fully exist, then we don't make the transition. Then that which must come to an end, game A, will come to an end, and we will not have any place to go. And that, of course, will be presumably somewhat unpleasant. So that's the story.
And some people would think that's quite naive to say that we can move beyond rivalry. How does the anti-rivalrous exist?
There's a whole lot to what you just said. The first part is that I find that almost everybody who accuses something of being naive are actually not engaging in what we were calling thinking earlier. That's a rhetorical move. That's not, in fact, a proposition. But let's move into the second. Remember I mentioned that these have been always present, that it is actually just a feature of reality that the rivalrous and the anti-rivalrous exist. It's just that nowadays we're in a situation where the anti-rivalrous is becoming more evident and more powerful in our day-to-day lives. So the rivalrous is most easily characterized by energy. So things that, if I have it, like say a glass of water or a barrel of oil, then you don't have it. It's one of those things. It's a real physical instantiated material coalescence of energy in an entropic environment. So that if you use it, then at least some of it is destroyed forever. Well, that's the rivalrous. Yep, we've got that all over the place, particularly food, water. Now on the other side of the continuum, sorry, not a continuum, on the other side is the anti-rivalrous. And in these days, the language that we would use is something like information. That, well, by me telling you this story about the nature of the anti-rivalrous, I lose nothing, except for the energy that I expended to tell it, but that's not the story. And you gain it. Whether you like it or not is a different story, but at least you have it. So now we both have it. And this is not novel. Like we've been talking about this nature of the scalability or the copyability of information ever since computers made it possible to do that. Remember music? But the other characteristic of the anti-rivalrous is that it becomes more valuable the more people who have it. That the rivalrous is valuable largely directly in relationship to the degree to which it is rare. The anti-rivalrous is valuable largely to the degree to which it is shared. And I don't mean that aspirationally, I don't mean that naively, I mean that rigorously logically. If I have a language and I'm the only one who speaks it, it's not very fucking useful. If I teach it to you and I teach it to him and I teach it to her and we all speak it, it's actually become very useful. The more people who speak it, the more powerful it has become. That is a very anti-rivalrous thing. The entire category of phenomena that are characterized by what's called the network effect or Metcalfe's law are associated at the basis with anti-rivalrous phenomena. Okay, well, let me just connect the dots, because I happen to have I've been an entrepreneur. I've built technology companies, and we're talking about how technology companies work. Collaboration is the birthplace, the origin of innovation. Innovation is anti-rivalrous. If I have invented calculus, I can then give you calculus, and it costs me nothing. And by the way, much, much easier than you inventing it yourself. And then you might do something with it, which is very powerful, that I would not have been able to do with it myself, so it's actually become more valuable. It's a more valuable tool the more useful, the more it's shared. Well, that's what we mean by the innovation economy. The essence of the innovation economy is the discovery of the degree to which a particular approach to working together, collaboration, is the essence of how we go about innovating. And innovation is anti-rivalrous. And innovation is the source of all wealth. If you actually go back and look at history, some wealth, a very tiny amount of wealth, is generated by the sweat of your brow. Well, I mean, again, Jesus said it well. Yes, I can fish, and I can get a fish, and I can give it to you. Rivalry. I don't have it, you have it, you eat for a day. Or I can teach you how to fish. Anti-rivalry. I have not lost anything, you've gained something, and maybe someday I won't catch a fish and you will, and you can give one to me. It's more valuable. Honestly, it's very simple. The challenge is actually more about the transition. The challenge is about how do we go about designing a new civilization structure on the basis of an anti-rivalrous psychology, and not on the basis of a rivalrous one, on the basis of a scarcity mentality. This is the real trick.
Because the people with the power are still working from the old model?
And even the people who don't have power but are thinking using the old model. Right? If your toolkit, what is the phrase? You cannot build a new house with the master's tools, or something like that. That's a nice phrase. If your toolkit is a toolkit that is in its basis, its very foundation, a response to scarcity and the scarcity mentality, designed to be adaptive to and operate within a rivalrous world, it's not the right toolkit for solving problems for and in an anti-rivalrous one. And so, but that's the toolkit we have, all the way down to the language that we use. And so we have to figure out how to do that sleight of hand, how to allow the space for this game B to emerge. And it will be emergent. It will be emergent by design. And we have a way to generate, almost like parenting. Parenting is the great example. I do not design my child. But parents are necessary if you want to have a child. The relationship of parent to child seems to have three specific requirements or roles. The first is obviously the creation of the fertilized egg, which becomes the zygote. The second is the womb, the creation of a space that allows this zygote to develop by and for itself on its own basis and on its own terms, right? Not outside in the world. Right? If I were to put the zygote of game B in the middle of game A, drop it onto the streets of the financial district, it would not survive very long. It is not yet strong enough to survive on its own in the world. But if we can create the zygote and then embed it in the womb, then there's the last piece of parenting, which is that when we think about ordinary design, like say an architect designing a house or an engineer designing a vehicle, all of the agency is on the part of the designer. But when we think about parenting, the agency of the parents is always fully in service of the agency of the child. And the agency of the child is primary. So we can generate the zygote, we can create the womb, and then we have to be able to always be mindful to put our agency in the service of this world that is in the process of giving birth to itself. And that's all that we can say.
In this analogy, what's the womb?
This is going to be spaces that are created and enabled to be available to the people who are experimenting with game B. So literally physically spaces, incubators as it were, or entirely new towns or cities. I actually know that, for example, a number of countries are in the process of endeavoring to figure out how to build quote-unquote smart cities of the future. So and the Chinese, of course, have built innumerable mega cities over the past several decades. Well, things like that are going to need to happen. Two or more are going to have to gather, and it's going to have to be a lot more than two. And they're going to need to learn how to gather first in small groups, just in houses and homes, and to create this territory and this space where they can gather and practice game B. And create, I think you said the field, but create a space where these practices are honored and they're explored. And then those groups are going to need to come into relationship in larger spaces. And perhaps this is where we start thinking about things like resources. I mean, one of the primary aspects of Game A is the necessity to continue to work in things that are not your highest purpose. So to the degree to which that we can build through innovation, through better innovation, the ability to bring more and more people into a space where they can simply fully enter into their most fully realized selves, and thereby become available to source and support superior innovation, we start getting an autocatalytic system. And again, let me present this in a way that is not naive. Let's take the lineage of technology companies. In fact, I'll own it since you've got a British accent. Technology companies in the United States of America. Let's go from Ford to Google. We can take steps. General Motors, IBM, Hewlett Packard, Apple, Microsoft, Google, just something like that. One of the things we notice as we go to that lineage is they have shifted from a more scarcity rivalry-based culture to a more abundance anti-rivalry-based culture. Henry Ford would have been rather surprised by the prospect that he should have fed all of his employees highly nutritious meals with personal chefs and provisioned them with places to play and to drive around on scooters. For Google, it's obvious, because that's how you create a space that is maximally conducive to creative collaboration, which is maximally conducive to innovation, which is maximally conducive to making a ton of money. We just need to push that further. What's the further envelope you can get? And I'm noticing this actually happening. Groups that I've been collaborating with are beginning the process of trying to construct entrepreneurial activities that show up as having a Game A side that can be very effective and competitive in Game A, but are actually anchored in a Game B side and are oriented towards generating and producing, taking the resources that come and providing them out into activities and envelopes that create these zones of, these wombs for continuing development and exploration of a more generative community. If that story, the story that I just told, is true, then it would be in our bones. It would be in our deepest mythology, in our deepest traditions, our deepest religion, that this is the place to go. That when trouble is brewing, gather together, enter into this space. This is where we do these sorts of things. This is how we solve these kinds of problems.